June 12, 1948. Cedar Falls, Iowa. The small Lutheran church on Maple Street had seen countless weddings over its 70-year history, but nothing quite like this. Townspeople filled every pew, some present out of genuine support, others driven by curiosity about the ceremony that had been the subject of heated debate for months. At the altar stood 26-year-old Klaus Richter, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his borrowed suit jacket. His blonde hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, but nothing could hide the nervous energy radiating from his tall frame. He spoke English now with only a slight accent, though under stress the German inflections became more pronounced. Standing beside him was his best man, John Mitchell, a local farmer who had initially threatened to run Klaus out of town 3 years earlier. The church doors opened, and Margaret Sullivan appeared in her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slender figure. At 23 years old, she looked radiant, despite the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of countless sleepless nights spent fighting for this moment. Her father, Robert Sullivan, walked stiffly beside her, his face a careful mask of controlled emotion. Every eye in the church knew the battle that had raged within the Sullivan household, the threats of disownment, the screaming matches that neighbors had heard through open windows on summer evenings. But what made this wedding truly extraordinary wasn't just the visible tension or the mixed reactions from the assembled guests. It was the fact that Klaus Richter had been an enemy prisoner of war just 3 years earlier, captured in North Africa and brought to a camp 20 miles outside Cedar Falls. He had worn the uniform of the Wehrmacht, had fought for Hitler's Germany, and had spent 2 years behind barbed wire while the war raged across 2 continents. Margaret had been the farmer's daughter who delivered milk to the prison camp, forbidden from even speaking to the German prisoners her father considered monsters. How does a man go from enemy combatant to beloved member of an Iowa farming community? How does love survive barbed wire, military regulations, community hatred, and the weight of a war that killed millions? Before we discover how Klaus and Margaret's impossible love story unfolded, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins 4 years and 9 months earlier, in September of 1943, when the first transport trucks carrying German prisoners rolled through the cornfields of rural Iowa, bringing with them men who would change this small community forever. Among those prisoners was a 21-year-old former schoolteacher from Hamburg who had no idea that his life was about to be transformed by a girl with copper-colored hair and eyes the color of Iowa sky. September 14, 1943 dawned cool and gray across northern Iowa. Margaret Sullivan sat in the passenger seat of her father's Ford pickup truck, watching the newly constructed prisoner of war camp appear on the horizon. Camp Algona had been built in just 4 months, transforming an empty stretch of farmland into a compound that would house over 3,000 German prisoners captured in North Africa and Sicily. Wooden barracks stretched in neat rows behind double fences of barbed wire, guard towers positioned at each corner like sentinels, watching over an enemy they had never expected to see in the heartland of America. Margaret's father had secured a contract to supply milk and dairy products to the camp, a decision that had sparked arguments at their dinner table. Her mother considered it profiting from the war, while her father argued that prisoners needed feeding regardless of politics. Margaret had remained quiet during these debates, but curiosity burned inside her. She had seen photographs of German soldiers in newspapers, had heard radio reports describing them as ruthless and fanatical, but those were distant images from foreign battlefields. These prisoners would be real men, close enough to see their faces. The first transport had arrived 3 days earlier, bringing 200 prisoners as an initial group. Margaret's father pulled up to the camp's supply gate, and a young American guard checked their delivery papers. Through the chain-link fence, Margaret could see groups of men in faded Wehrmacht uniforms moving between buildings, their movements slow and uncertain. They looked younger than she had expected, most appearing to be in their early 20s. Some had bandages visible beneath their uniforms, evidence of wounds sustained in combat. As her father unloaded metal milk cans from the truck bed, Margaret found herself drawn to the fence line. She knew she shouldn't stare, that her father would disapprove, but something compelled her to look closer at these men who had traveled across an ocean to fight a war that now left them imprisoned in Iowa cornfields. That's when she saw him. A tall prisoner with blonde hair stood near the fence, perhaps 20 feet away, holding a broom he had clearly been using to sweep the area near the barracks. He looked up at the sound of the truck, and for a brief moment, their eyes met across the barrier of wire and distance. Klaus Richter had been a schoolteacher in Hamburg before the war, drafted into military service in 1941 when Germany's need for soldiers became desperate. He had survived the brutal heat of the North African campaign, had watched friends die in the sand, and had finally been captured by British forces near Tunis. Now standing in this strange flat landscape so different from anything he had known, he found himself looking into the bluest eyes he had ever seen. The first note appeared 3 weeks after that initial eye contact. Margaret had convinced her father to let her make the milk deliveries alone, arguing that he needed to focus on the farm's fall harvest. In truth, she found herself thinking about the blonde German prisoner more than she cared to admit. Each Tuesday and Friday she drove to the camp, and each time she noticed him working near the fence line, always close enough to see, but never attempting to approach. On October 5, 1943, everything changed. As Margaret set down the last milk can near the supply gate, she noticed a small piece of paper wedged into the fence post nearest to where she parked. Her heart pounded as she glanced toward the guard tower. The sentry was looking the other direction. She quickly palmed the paper and tucked it into her jacket pocket, not daring to read it until she was safely back in her truck a mile down the road. The note was written in careful English on what appeared to be torn from a ration package. "Thank you for bringing us fresh milk. It reminds some of us of home. My name is Klaus. I was a teacher before the war. I miss teaching children about books and history. What is your name?" The handwriting was precise, each letter formed with obvious care. Margaret knew she should throw the note away. Her father would be furious if he discovered any communication with prisoners. The camp rules strictly forbade fraternization between civilians and POWs. But that evening, sitting at her desk by candlelight, she found herself writing a response on a scrap of paper torn from her grocery list. "My name is Margaret. I have never been further than Des Moines. What was Hamburg like before the war?" The exchange of notes became a dangerous ritual through autumn and into the bitter Iowa winter. Margaret would tuck her message into the fence post, and Klaus would retrieve it when the guard's attention shifted elsewhere. His replies appeared in the same location, sometimes within hours, sometimes not until her next delivery. Through these fragments of paper, they constructed entire worlds for each other. Klaus described the bookshops along the Alster River, the smell of fresh pretzels from street vendors, his students' faces when he read them adventure stories. Margaret wrote about sunrise over cornfields, county fairs, her dreams of becoming a nurse, her fear that the war would never end. But they weren't alone in their secret correspondence. Guard Sergeant William Parker had noticed other local women lingering near the fence during supply deliveries. A baker's daughter named Helen had been passing notes to a prisoner named Friedrich. Two sisters who worked at the camp laundry had developed friendships with prisoners they supervised. Love, it seemed, had found a way to grow even in the frozen ground of a prison camp, hidden from authorities who would never understand. March 17, 1944, arrived with the first hints of warmth after Iowa's brutal winter. Margaret drove to Camp Algona with her windows rolled down, breathing in air that finally didn't burn her lungs with cold. She had a letter tucked into her coat pocket, longer than usual, in which Klaus had written about his mother's garden in Hamburg and how he wondered if the roses she had planted still bloomed now that the city endured constant bombing raids. Margaret had planned to respond with descriptions of her own mother's flower beds, but she never got the chance. As she pulled up to the supply gate, she immediately sensed something wrong. Guard Sergeant Parker stood waiting for her, his expression grave. Beside him was Captain Thomas Warren, the camp's commanding officer, a man she had only seen from a distance during previous deliveries. Her hands went cold despite the spring warmth. "Miss Sullivan," Captain Warren said quietly, "I need you to come with me to the administration building. Your father has been notified and is on his way." The words hit her like a physical blow. They knew. Somehow, they had discovered the notes. As she walked between the two men toward the main office, she saw Klaus standing near the barracks, his face pale, two guards flanking him. Their eyes met for a brief second before a guard roughly turned Klaus away. In the captain's office, Margaret learned that a routine inspection had uncovered several notes hidden in Klaus's footlocker. Another prisoner, resentful of Klaus's friendliness with American staff, had reported the correspondence to curry favor with authorities. Within hours, the entire network of secret communications had been exposed. Helen and Friedrich's letters were discovered. The laundry room romances were revealed. 5 local women and 7 German prisoners now faced consequences that could range from embarrassment to criminal charges. Captain Warren sat behind his desk, studying Margaret with tired eyes. He was 52 years old, a career military man who had seen action in the First World War and understood the complexity of human nature better than most. "Miss Sullivan, you understand that fraternization with enemy prisoners violates military regulations. Your father is understandably upset. These prisoners are not here to make friends. They're here because they fought against our country." Margaret found her voice, though it shook. "He didn't fight against anyone, Captain. He taught children. He was drafted. And the letters were only about books and home and ordinary things. Nothing about the war. Nothing dangerous." She paused, then added more quietly, "Nothing that should matter to anyone except us." What happened next surprised everyone. Captain Warren leaned back in his chair and sighed deeply. "I fought in France in 1918, he said. "I saw German soldiers up close. Some were monsters. Most were just scared boys far from home, same as us." Captain Warren's compromise was unprecedented. Rather than punishing the women or transferring the prisoners, he established supervised visiting hours on Sunday afternoons in the camp's recreation hall. The women could meet with the prisoners they had been corresponding with, but only under direct observation of guards, and only for 2 hours each week. The arrangement satisfied neither the hardliners who wanted all contact forbidden, nor the couples who yearned for privacy, but it represented something more valuable than either. It represented official acknowledgement that human connection couldn't be simply commanded away. The first supervised visit took place on March 26, 1944. Margaret entered the recreation hall feeling as if she were walking to her own trial. 6 wooden tables had been arranged in neat rows, guards positioned along the walls. Klaus sat at the third table, his hands folded in front of him, wearing a clean uniform that someone had clearly helped him press for the occasion. When he stood as she approached, she noticed he was taller than she had realized, and his blue eyes held a mixture of hope and apprehension that mirrored her own feelings. "Hello, Margaret," he said softly, pronouncing her name carefully. "It is strange to finally speak to you after so many letters." His accent was more pronounced in person than she had imagined from his precise, written English. She sat across from him, acutely aware of the guard standing 15 feet away, of Helen and Friedrich at the next table speaking in hushed tones, of the weight of everything that stood between them. They talked about safe topics at first. Klaus described his work assignment in the camp's woodworking shop, where prisoners made furniture for military bases across the region. Margaret spoke about her job helping at the county library 3 days a week, about books she thought he might enjoy. But gradually, as the 2 hours unfolded, their conversation deepened into territory their letters had only hinted at. Klaus admitted his guilt about his family in Hamburg, his feeling that he had abandoned them by being captured. Margaret confessed her fear of what the town thought of her, of whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the general store. Outside the camp walls, Cedar Falls was indeed talking. The local newspaper ran an editorial questioning whether allowing fraternization with enemy prisoners sent the wrong message to soldiers fighting overseas. The American Legion Post passed a resolution condemning the practice, but other voices emerged in defense. Reverend Charles Morrison of the Methodist Church preached a sermon about loving one's enemies that made half the congregation walk out mid-service, while the other half rose in standing ovation. Margaret's father remained coldly furious. He forbade her from returning to the camp, but at 21 years old, Margaret made her own choice. August 15, 1945, the war was over. In towns across America, celebrations erupted with the news of Japan's surrender. But in Camp Algona, the German prisoners faced an uncertain reality. Victory meant they would be repatriated, sent back to a homeland many no longer recognized. For Klaus Richter, the end of war brought news that shattered what remained of his old life. The letter arrived through the International Red Cross on August 23rd. Klaus had been waiting 16 months for any word from Hamburg, sending inquiry after inquiry through proper channels. Margaret sat across from him during their Sunday visit as he opened the envelope with shaking hands. She watched his face transform as he read, watched him age 10 years in the span of 60 seconds. His mother, his father, his younger sister Greta, all killed during the firebombing of Hamburg in July of 1943, just 2 months before he had first seen Margaret through the fence. He didn't cry. His face simply became a mask of stone as he carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. "They are gone," he said in German, then repeated in English, "They are all gone. There is nothing left." Margaret reached across the table to take his hand, forgetting the rules, forgetting the guard who stepped forward then paused, perhaps recognizing that some moments deserved privacy, even in captivity. In the following weeks, repatriation procedures began for Camp Algona's prisoners. Transport schedules were posted. Men packed their few possessions. Some prisoners were eager to return despite the devastation, driven by hope that something or someone had survived. Others faced the prospect with dread, knowing they returned to nothing but rubble and grief. Klaus fell into this second category, his usual optimism replaced by hollow resignation. Margaret's world began to crumble alongside his. For 2 years, they had built something precious in those Sunday afternoon visits. They had fallen in love through letters and supervised conversations, through shared books and halting discussions about everything from music to philosophy. Klaus had taught her German phrases. She had helped him perfect his English. They had created a small universe that existed only in those 2 hours each week. But it was real, and it mattered more than anything else in her life. On September 2nd, Captain Warren called them both to his office. "Richter, you're scheduled for transport on September 28th. You'll be processed through New York, then shipped to Hamburg." He paused, looking between them. "I want you both to understand what this means. Once he's repatriated, there's no mechanism for return. Germany is in ruins. Communication will be nearly impossible. You need to consider whether continuing this relationship serves either of your interests." The question hung in the air between them, unspoken but deafening. Could love survive not just distance, but the complete severing of all connection? The confrontation at the Sullivan farmhouse happened 3 days after Captain Warren's announcement. Margaret had been dreading this conversation, but she could no longer avoid it. She sat at the kitchen table across from her parents, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Her father's face was red with anger, her mother's eyes filled with tears. "You will not throw your life away for a German soldier," Robert Sullivan said, his voice low and dangerous. "I have tolerated this foolishness because Warren convinced me it was harmless. But this ends now. When that prisoner leaves, you will not follow him with letters or phone calls or whatever fantasy you've constructed in your head." He leaned forward, his calloused farmer's hands flat on the table. "If you continue this relationship, you are no longer welcome in this house. You are no longer my daughter." Margaret had prepared herself for this ultimatum, but hearing the words still felt like a physical blow. Her mother reached across the table, her voice pleading. "Margaret, honey, you're 21 years old. There are good men right here in Cedar Falls. Men who fought for our country. Men your father approves of. Why would you choose someone who can offer you nothing but shame and struggle?" But Margaret had already made her choice, even if she didn't yet know how to make it real. "Because he sees me," she said quietly. "Not the farmer's daughter who should know her place. Not the small-town girl who isn't smart enough for anything beyond marriage and children. He talks to me about books and ideas. He asks what I think, what I dream about. He makes me feel like I matter." Meanwhile, Klaus faced his own crisis of conscience. In the barracks, several prisoners challenged his growing attachment to Margaret. "You would betray the fatherland by staying with the enemy?" asked Werner Schmidt, an older prisoner who had been a party member before the war. "Your family died while you played house with an American girl. Have you no shame?" The words cut deeply because Klaus himself harbored the same guilt. He lay awake nights wondering if he was dishonoring his family's memory by choosing love over duty to return and help rebuild Germany. He wrote letters he never sent, trying to explain to his dead mother why he couldn't come home to her grave. His diary from this period, later preserved, shows a man torn between two impossible choices. On September 15th, Klaus requested a meeting with Captain Warren. "I want to apply to stay in America," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know it is difficult. I know there are regulations. But I must try." Warren studied him for a long moment. "Do you understand what you're asking? The legal battles? The years it might take? The possibility that you'll be deported anyway after fighting to stay? The legal framework for a German prisoner of war to remain in the United States and eventually become a citizen was virtually non-existent in 1945. Captain Warren connected Klaus with an immigration attorney in Des Moines, named Samuel Goldstein, himself a Jewish refugee who had fled Germany in 1938. Goldstein took the case not for money, which Klaus had none to offer, but because he believed in the possibility of individual redemption even when nations failed at it. The first obstacle was preventing Klaus's immediate deportation. On September 27th, one day before his scheduled transport, Goldstein filed an emergency petition with the Immigration and Naturalization Service, arguing that Klaus should be reclassified as a displaced person rather than a prisoner of war. The argument was technical but crucial. Displaced persons could apply for asylum. Prisoners of war could not. The petition bought them time, 60 days initially, then extended by another 90, when Goldstein demonstrated that Klaus had no surviving family and that returning to Hamburg would place him in potential danger from Soviet-occupied zones. Margaret threw herself into the fight with fierce determination. She took a second job at the textile mill in Waterloo, working the overnight shift after her library hours. On weekends, she cleaned houses for wealthy families in Cedar Rapids. Every dollar she earned went to legal fees, filing costs, and the endless bureaucratic expenses of fighting the immigration system. She existed on 4 hours of sleep per night, dark circles permanently shadowing her eyes, her hands rough from industrial cleaning solutions. Klaus remained at Camp Algona in a strange limbo status, no longer officially a prisoner, but not yet free. He was transferred to a smaller facility where several other German POWs awaiting similar determinations were housed. He was allowed to work outside the camp under supervision, taking a position at a furniture factory where his woodworking skills earned respect from American workers initially suspicious of having a German among them. The legal battle stretched from months into a year, then beyond. Each small victory was followed by new complications. The INS argued Klaus presented a security risk. Goldstein countered with testimony from Captain Warren and other camp officials vouching for his character. When the INS claimed Klaus hadn't properly denounced Nazi ideology, 23 local residents signed affidavits describing his open condemnation of Hitler's regime and his genuine remorse for Germany's actions. Slowly, something shifted in Cedar Falls. People who had initially condemned the relationship began to witness the price Margaret and Klaus were willing to pay for it. John Mitchell, the farmer who had once threatened Klaus, appeared at a town council meeting to speak in his favor. "I've worked alongside him for 6 months at the factory," Mitchell said. "He's a good man. Works hard. Never complains. If we can't forgive one decent German, what hope do we have for forgiving an entire nation?" April 3, 1947. 18 months after the legal battle began, Samuel Goldstein called Margaret with news that made her collapse into a chair at the library where she worked. Klaus had been granted permission to remain in the United States and could begin the process of applying for permanent residency and eventual citizenship. The INS had finally accepted that he posed no security threat and that his case had sufficient humanitarian merit. It would still be years before he could become a citizen, but he would not be deported. He was allowed to stay. Klaus learned the news while working at the furniture factory. He stood motionless at his workbench for a full minute, the chisel frozen in his hand, before his supervisor Frank Coleman clapped him on the shoulder. "Congratulations, Klaus. Now you can stop living like you're packed to leave any minute." That evening, Klaus and Margaret met at the small diner on Main Street, where they had been allowed to have supervised meetings once his legal status shifted. For the first time in 2 years, they could speak freely without guards watching, without time limits, without the weight of impending separation crushing every conversation. But one obstacle remained. Robert Sullivan had not spoken to his daughter beyond necessary communication in over a year. Margaret had been living in a boarding house near the library, supporting herself through her 2 jobs while sending every spare dollar to legal fees. The estrangement from her father caused her deeper pain than she admitted to Klaus, though he saw it in her eyes whenever she mentioned her family. The breakthrough came unexpectedly on a Saturday morning in late April. Robert Sullivan appeared at the furniture factory asking to speak with Klaus. Frank Coleman, sensing the importance of the moment, gave them privacy in his office. Robert stood by the window, his back to Klaus, silent for a long moment before speaking. "I've been asking around about you," he finally said. "Everyone tells me you work hard, you don't complain, you treat people with respect. Frank says you're the best craftsman he's employed in 20 years. Klaus waited, understanding that interruption would be wrong. Robert turned to face him. "I fought in the First War. France. I saw what Germans did to our boys. I swore I'd never forgive that. But you're not those Germans, are you?" Klaus shook his head. "No, sir. I am just one man who wants to build a life with your daughter, if you will permit it." Robert extended his hand. "She's my only child. You break her heart, and Iowa isn't big enough to hide you. But if you love her the way she clearly loves you, then you have my blessing." June 12, 1948. The wedding ceremony at the Lutheran Church continued as Reverend Morrison asked if anyone objected to the union. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the rustle of programs and the distant sound of birds outside. 3 years earlier, a dozen voices would have risen in protest. Now, not one person spoke against the marriage they were witnessing. Klaus and Margaret had requested something unusual for their ceremony. Instead of traditional vows, they asked permission to read aloud from the letters they had exchanged through the fence. Reverend Morrison had agreed, understanding that these fragments of paper represented something sacred. Margaret withdrew the first note from her bouquet, the one Klaus had written on October 5, 1943. Her voice shook slightly as she read his careful English asking for her name, his description of missing teaching children about books and history. Klaus then read Margaret's response, preserved, despite its origin on a torn grocery list. The congregation listened as the courtship unfolded through these scraps of paper, through descriptions of Hamburg bookshops and Iowa sunrises, through fears and hopes shared across barbed wire. Several people in the pews wiped their eyes, moved by the simple humanity captured in words written when such connection was forbidden. When Klaus slipped the ring onto Margaret's finger, John Mitchell stood to make an announcement. The community had taken a collection to give the newlyweds a wedding gift. They had raised enough money to purchase a small house on Elm Street, previously owned by a widow who had moved to live with her daughter in Chicago. The keys were presented in an envelope along with letters from 73 Cedar Falls residents welcoming Klaus as a neighbor and citizen in waiting. 25 years later, in June of 1973, that same church held a celebration of Klaus and Margaret's silver anniversary. Their 3 children, all with German first names and Irish middle names, helped organize the event. The oldest, Anna Margaret, was a teacher like her father. The twin boys, Friedrich Robert and Hans Michael, ran the expanded furniture business their father had purchased from Frank Coleman upon his retirement. But the most significant aspect of the celebration was the announcement that the original letters exchanged between Klaus and Margaret would be donated to the Iowa Historical Society. These fragile scraps of paper, carefully preserved in a wooden box Klaus had crafted, would become part of an exhibit about POW camps in the Midwest and the unexpected romances that bloomed behind barbed wire. Klaus stood before the assembled guests, now 51 years old, his blonde hair graying but his blue eyes still bright. Margaret and I were enemies who became friends, then lovers, then family. Our letters proved that even war cannot stop the human heart from recognizing kindness in another soul.